If you're a PhD student working on a qualitative study and you've already written your literature review, but now it feels a bit disjointed, outdated, or it just doesn't reflect the research that you've ended up doing, this video is for you. Many PhD researchers at this stage think they need to rewrite the literature review, but in most cases, that's not the real issue. The real issue is that the structure no longer reflects how their thinking has evolved. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what to do if you find yourself in this position. The anxiety and the worry that PhD researchers experience at this stage is something I've come across a lot in the 20 years I've been supporting them. I know just how frustrating this can be, but there's a way out of this that doesn't involve anywhere near the amount of work that you might think it does. So let's get into it. The first thing you need to know is that this is not about reading more. At this stage, most researchers don't need to read a lot more. You've probably already done a significant amount of reading. You've got dozens of PDFs, extensive notes, highlighted articles, and a drafted and sometimes fully written literature review chapter. And admittedly, that literature review chapter might feel completely out of sync now. It no longer reflects the research that you've actually done. And the instinct at this point is often, maybe I just need to read more. But that's not usually the issue here. It's more about whether the structure of your literature review now makes conceptual sense in terms of where your study now stands. Because over time, your research will have evolved. Your questions may have sharpened. Your data may have shifted your focus. Your analysis might be pointing you somewhere more specific than you originally anticipated. And when that happens, often your original literature review structure no longer holds. So the issue is not, have I read enough? The issue is, does this structure reflect how I now understand my research? Let me ask you something now and get into the comments on this. When you look at your literature review now, does it still feel coherent in terms of the research that you've actually done? Pop your thoughts on that question down there. What this question brings to light is really important because this is where the work needs to happen. We need to reevaluate your existing themes, your existing headings. At this stage, it's likely that the themes or the headings that you started out with no longer fit the research that you've done. They might feel slightly too broad, disconnected, or just not aligned with what's come out of the data. And that can create the sense that something is slightly off with your literature review, and you can't quite explain why. So rather than asking what themes or headings should I include, a more useful question at this point is this one. What concepts is my research actually built around at this point? Look at the themes and the headings in your literature review. Do they still reflect the conceptual work that your research is doing? Or are they anchored in an earlier version of your study? This is often where we start to see the disconnection. The goal here is not to create a brand new structure. It's to realign your existing one so it reflects how you now understand your research. Here, we're doing some retrofitting, some reverse engineering, and it can be helpful to look at this through the lens of an example. Imagine a qualitative PhD in nursing. It's examining how newly qualified nurses experience the transition into clinical practice. Step one is to start with what you already have. At this stage, the researcher already has a literature review. It's structured around themes like transition shock, professional identity formation, stress and burnout, organisational support. At the time the literature review was first written, This made sense. It worked. It reflected the dominant conversations in the literature. Step 2 is to bring in what your research has become. Now we fast forward. Data collection is complete, analysis has been carried out, and the findings are pointing somewhere slightly different. What's come through in the data is uncertainty around decision making, negotiating responsibility, knowing when to act independently, interpreting what competence actually means in practice. So already we have a shift, not a completely different topic, but a more specific, more grounded understanding of the research focus. Step 3 is to put these two side by side. Instead of rewriting everything, do something much simpler. Map the two structures next to each other. On the one side are the existing literature review themes. On the other are the key concepts emerging from the analysis. And this is where things become clearer. Step 4 is to identify what works, what doesn't, and what's still missing. When you're comparing the two, 3 things usually happen. Firstly, you'll see that some areas still align. For example, professional identity is still relevant here. Secondly, some areas are no longer central. In the example, stress and burnout haven't disappeared, but they're no longer organising or central to the argument. They become part of a broader discussion about the pressures of decision making. And thirdly, some important concepts might be missing entirely. In the example, there's very little in the original structure about clinical judgment, decision making in practice, and responsibility in early career roles. This is where the original literature review isn't doing its job properly. Not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete in relation to where the research now stands. Step 5 is to make targeted readjustments, not perform a full rewrite. You don't start again, you readjust. You refine existing themes, you reposition others. And you engage with the literature that's around the concepts emerging from your findings. So where there is more reading that needs to be done, it's not more reading in general, it's more precise reading, focused very specifically on what matters. Step 6 is to restructure around your current understanding. The literature review is then reorganised around themes like this: developing clinical judgment in early career practice, negotiating responsibility and accountability, understanding competence in context. And now something important happens. Your literature review and your findings start to speak to each other. The structure supports the analysis, and the discussion chapter becomes easier to write. And the argument becomes more coherent because you're not starting over, you're not trying to fix things. You're re-evaluating and making adjustments. A question that comes up a lot at this stage is, well, now I've done all that, what's left for the discussion chapter? If you've gone back and realigned your literature review, what role does the discussion chapter play? Because it can start to feel like, well, haven't I already done the work of linking my research back to the literature? But these 2 chapters are doing different things, and that distinction matters. The literature review sets the conceptual landscape. Once you've reworked your literature review, its role is to clarify the concepts that your research is built around, show how those concepts are understood in existing literature, identify tensions, gaps, and patterns, and establish the conceptual territory that your study sits within. So, after revising your literature review, it should feel aligned, it should feel coherent, and it should feel directly relevant to the study that you've done. But, and this is important, it is still doing that work in advance of your findings. The discussion chapter does something different. The discussion chapter is where your research actually enters that landscape. This is where you take your findings and ask, how do these findings extend what we already know? Where do they confirm existing interpretations? Where do they challenge or complicate them? What do they reveal that wasn't fully visible in the literature before? So, even if your literature review is now really well aligned, it's not making those claims, it's preparing the ground for them. Here's a simple way to think about the difference. The literature review says, here is how this area is currently understood. The discussion chapter comes along and says, here's how my research develops that understanding. Realigning the literature review is actually really helpful for the discussion. Doing this work properly makes the discussion chapter easier. It doesn't make it redundant. Because now you're not forcing connections between unrelated things. Your key concepts are already well defined, and your findings are positioned within a framework that actually fits. So instead of trying to create coherence in the discussion chapter, you are working with a coherence that already exists. Updating your literature review doesn't replace the discussion chapter, it enables it. Because the discussion chapter is not where you introduce the literature. It's where you use it, you develop it, and you challenge it through your findings. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have, there are another couple appearing on the screen right now that you might also enjoy. So go and check them out. I'll see you in there.